Have you ever looked at an old anime and thought, wow, I want my art to look like this? Well, I did, and I've been developing the secrets of how to make retro-looking art ever since. Here are some of my pieces, if you need any proof. Making anime art straight from the 90s is what I do. There are a lot of moving parts involved to get just the right look, but I've broken it down into 6 steps that you can follow to get that nostalgic aesthetic. Style, pens and colors, background, captions, filters, and saving. Strap in, get comfy, and watch until the end to learn all the tips and tricks to making your art truly retro. We'll be starting first with the style of the art, the way that something is drawn. These are things that you'll want to pay attention to before any of the other steps, because this often involves a lot of studying in order to nail down a specific art style. For my art style specifically, I studied especially Ranma 1/2, which you can see on the screen, Slayers, and Sailor Moon. They're all very 80s, 90s, kind of very distinctive in their looks, especially in the eyes. The eyes are something that you want to pay attention to, especially in terms of figuring out how you want your style to look, or if you're just trying to do art based on one specific style, getting the style of the eyes specifically down, as well as the shape of the face, how round or sharp it is. Slayers is a little bit sharper, whereas Sailor Moon is very round and soft, and Ranma faces are often a bit wider than other faces. Now, there are other things that you'll want to look out for in the style as well, which I'll just briefly point over here, such as the noses. The noses in all 3 of these are very slightly different, as well as how mouths are drawn, how different expressions are drawn. A lot of practice is going to need to be put into figuring out these small details in the style of the art. But everyone has their own art style, and you can incorporate these things into your art style without completely replicating one of these existing styles. Now I'm going to talk about pens. I'm going to use an example study that I've done. This one is of a screenshot from Slayers, where, as you can see, I have drawn myself in the style of this screenshot from Slayers in order to study the style. It's not a one-to-one. I didn't trace this. I based it on my own sketch. You can see here, if I activate the sketch layer, this is the sketch of this drawing. You can see how I personally break down the sketch into different colors. This is just how I work on my own. But what we're going to be paying attention to especially, and this isn't unique to Slayers, but almost all retro anime, is the style of the line art and how it's drawn. You'll see a few things that I'm going to focus on, such as how there's a slight grain to this line art. I use a pen that has this slight grain effect to it because older anime doesn't typically have completely and entirely clean lines. Usually the pens have a slight grain to them, a bit of texture. And the lines are also usually, especially for characters, less so for backgrounds and effects, but particularly for characters, the lines will be drawn using black. So that's something to pay attention to. For the colors, what I'm going to draw your attention to specifically is the coloring. If I remove all the effects that I've added that we'll talk about later, you can see that the style is a lot more flat. In anime, especially retro anime, the shading will typically be what is called cell shading. That means that there are these clear lines between areas of shading, highlights, and the base color. And you'll want to, usually I shade using my line art brush to give it the edge that grain as well, though you can color in block areas with just a flat brush as well. Now, particularly how you want to do the shading, that's a whole other topic. I'm not going to teach you how to shade in this video, but some things to keep in mind are how to shade the hair, or specifically the highlights in the hair. Hair highlights often have this sort of band of light that travels through the hair, often very wiggly, and incorporating that into the art will give it a very retro anime sort of look. The eyes also will have these big blocks of light inside of them. Now, the backgrounds don't always follow this cell shading rule. We're going to touch on backgrounds later, that's one of the other topics, but if we're focusing on characters, specifically things that would be animated. If you imagine an anime, some things are background and some things are animated. Now, what we're talking about here are things that are animated. These are cell shaded, they have these black lines that are grainy, and when it comes to the shading specifically, there's usually very minimal different layers of shading. So you'll see here we have the base color, and then we also have just one extra layer of shading on top of that. You can see the base color of the shirt is white. We have a layer of gray shading. The base color of the hair is this blonde color. We have a layer of dark shading behind that too. There's not many extra shading colors used, so we don't have another color of blonde. There's a highlight, of course, but we don't have another color of blonde shading. We don't have another color of gray for the shirt. Usually just one or two different shading layers is enough for that retro effect. Remember that these are based on anime. These are based on things that are animated and made to be drawn quickly and without significant time and effort, so they were often simplified in this way. Next, I want to talk about backgrounds. So there are a lot of things that you can do with backgrounds. There's not really a steady and fast rule that you can go with for absolutely everything. There are many different types of backgrounds you might want to do. This one that I have on the screen at the moment is a much simpler sort of background. These are typically a bit easier. This one is mostly just a gradient. And then using especially things that you'll see commonly in anime in general, but in retro anime as well. Effects like these bubbles and these shines, you can get these as a brush in Clip Studio actually. And these give a very retro effect with very minimal effort. This background did not take long at all. If you want to do a slightly more complex background, this is one that I drew myself, but you'll see that this one too is just some gradients. You'll see in this one as well that the gradient that I've used has this grain to it. It doesn't have a smooth edge to it. It has a grainy effect, and that gives it a bit more texture. This is something that's very common in retro anime. You'll see it here in this next example I have as well. So this is a slightly more complex background. You'll see here that there's some grainy gradient on the road, but you can still see these different lines. The black lines that I've used in the background for these sides of the road. The sky though, and the clouds don't have these. You can see if I zoom in on the sky, the clouds, they don't have a black outline. They're much softer. The sky as well is a blend of different textures and shapes, and the highlights are just layered directly onto the clouds. You want to use a combination of different shading techniques and background techniques in order to make something look retro. It depends on what exactly you're trying to replicate. Another example I'll give for backgrounds is this one. This is a very watercolory sort of background. You can see here that it's very soft. We have very basic colors. Watercolor backgrounds, although this isn't specifically watercolor because all of my art is digital, but it's very much styled to look as if it were drawn that way, with the rough edges, the blending between different things. It gives it a very retro, a very soft sort of look. The fourth section that I'd like to talk about, which is an optional section depending on how you want to present your art, I personally really like it, is including some anime captions in your art. Now, when you think of an anime screenshot, you'll often think of it with those very iconic yellow subtitles. And I'm going to show you how to style those in a retro anime style to add them to your art. Now, here's some example ones that I'm going to put on the screen. I'm going to reduce the opacity of the original image just to show you. This yellow right here, you can see, uses this hex code. And we're going to want to put this in the Altehasque Grotesque font. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm trying my best. You can see that up here. And I usually set it to italics, and I'll often put this little dash at the front of it. These are very common things that you'll see in anime subtitles. And then finally, in addition to these and making it yellow, making it the right font, is you're going to want to add a stroke to it, a border to it. Just a little one. I usually only make it about 11 pixels. It's going to depend on how big your canvas is and how big your captions are. But if I set the opacity back up again, you can see this makes the captions stand out a lot more. We're more than halfway through now. If you've been enjoying the video so far, you should click that subscribe button. It's totally free and helps me out a ton. Like the video while you're at it and share it with your art buddies so they can make some cool retro anime art too. Anyway, back to the video. Now then, the next and maybe the most complicated step is the filters. This is going to have a very big effect on how retro your art looks, but there are quite a few different filters you're going to want to add in order to achieve that effect. The first thing you're going to want to do, you're going to want to take your unedited image, well, add the captions. If you'd like to have the captions, you can see that I have that here. From that unedited image, you're going to then add a Gaussian blur filter. Now, the Gaussian blur filter, you're going to want to add roughly, I typically add about 2.5 pixels of Gaussian blur. This is enough to make it a bit blurry, but obviously you don't want to lose the quality and distinction in your work. Then we're going to duplicate that layer and we're going to add a motion blur in addition to the Gaussian blur that layer already had. Now this motion blur I usually set to around 70px, and we're going to set it to the saturation layer mode. Now this is going to give it a very particular sort of look. You'll see it looks something like this. We're going to duplicate that layer again, and we're going to set it instead. It's going to have all the same settings. It's a duplicate of the last layer with the motion blur, but now this one is set to hue. And we're layering an effect of this, this blurring, this smearing of the colors in the image. Now we'll make one more copy of that layer, but we're going to set the layer type this time to exclusion, and we're going to set it to 28% opacity. After that, we'll duplicate the first layer again, set it to Gaussian blur, this time a little bit more. I usually choose around 30, and then set it to lighten at 26% opacity. Doing this will reduce the saturation of the image. It'll make it look very washed out, but that's not a bad thing. We're going to be correcting that and adding to that with the following filters. The next filter I like to add is merely a pink block set to multiply and set to around 10% opacity to give it that slight pink tint that you often see in older anime. Think of degraded Sailor Moon with its very pink sort of look to it. Giving it that kind of slight pink look makes it feel a little bit more dreamy. Now we're going to make a gradient map adjustment layer. We're going to set it to the exclusion layer type at around 10% opacity, and the specific gradient map that we're going to go for is going to be a custom gradient map that starts with black, then purple, then pink, then orange, then a navy blue, and then black again. We're going to add one more gradient map. In addition to this one is going to also be set to exclusion, this one at around 8% opacity. And this one is going to have black, cyan, green, yellow, pink, and black for the gradient map. Adding these adjustment layers will adjust the color balance of the image, reduce the saturation, and make it look a bit more washed out. Again, we're going to be layering these effects in order to achieve the retro look that we want. Now, the next filter that I like to add is some grain. We're going to do this by adding a noise filter, and the noise filter we're going to set to color dodge and then just layer it over what we have already to add that grain to the image, make it look nice and gritty. Now we're going to add some filters to readjust the color balance a little bit. We're going to start with a curves adjustment layer, and we're going to pull up the top a little bit and pull down the bottom a little bit. Now you'll see that this affects the saturation that we have. It's going to bring back in the colors, darken things a lot more. And then we're going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer to amplify this effect a little bit further. We're going to reduce the hue and we're going to increase the saturation a little bit. And you can see that these bring the colors back in a little bit. Now, the next step in our filters, we're going to be using two filters in order to adjust the amount of colors in the image. We're going to be using a posterize adjustment layer for the first one, and we're going to change the levels to 78. Then we're going to add a levels adjustment effect with the levels 5, 1.17, and 240. The image itself now has a fewer amount of actual colors used. It reduces the gradients and how smooth they are to give them a little bit more of a retro and cel-shaded effect to mimic the sort of limited palette that would be used in an anime like this. And the final stage of our filters, we're going to be desaturating and darkening the image. Usually retro anime have very deep, dark colors when it comes to the darker colors, and they're usually not very saturated. So we're going to be starting with a gradient map. Now this gradient map is going to be using a black to green map set to the saturation layer type and 21% opacity. You're going to see that this lowers the brightness of the image overall. It makes things a lot softer, desaturated, and we're going to be adding to that a little bit further with a levels filter a levels adjustment layer. And this levels adjustment layer will have 27, 1.11, and 255 as the 3 points that we're adjusting. And you'll see this darkens it very significantly. This makes the blacks very, very deep compared to the rest of the image, which makes it really stand out with these popping, brighter sections while still keeping the saturation relatively low. There are no crazy high saturation levels in this image. And the final stage of our 6-part retro effects tutorial is we're going to be saving the image in a very particular way. Now, if you think about these retro anime, part of the way in which we would consume them is not only watching them, but also the images being shared in a certain way online. These are very old images that have been shared and reshared a lot, and typically the quality of the image itself degrades over time. So to replicate that, we're going to be saving this as a JPEG. We're going to be saving it at around 70% quality in order to degrade the image itself just enough in order to have that artifacting over the image to make it look like an actual screenshot someone took from an anime a long time ago. We're also going to be saving it at a small size. You don't want the image itself to be super big. You can draw on your canvas as big or as small as you'd like, but I typically save the images to be less than 1,000 pixels, because anime back in these days, and not just the anime, but also the computer screens that we would be watching them on, or the TV screens themselves as well, would not be this high resolution. So you want the screen, you want the image itself to be smaller in order to represent the smaller sizes of the screens and the images that are being displayed. And that's about it. If you follow these steps, you'll no doubt be able to give your art an authentic retro look. Feel free to mix and match with these steps, as they're based on my own art style and experiences, and everyone's art is different. I usually draw in Clip Studio Paint and do the filters using Photopea, but there are a lot of different programs that can achieve similar results. Also, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments which retro anime inspires you the most. See you next time!